The 10th of February 1942. 9,000 feet above Wake Island, Lieutenant Commander John Thach could feel his Grumman F-4F Wildcat bucking gently under the Pacific wind. His gloved fingers tightened on the control stick. Through his scratched canopy, 6 dots grew rapidly enemy aircraft. Zeros. Fast. Elegant. Deadly. The sun glinted off the silvery wings of WWII. 6 missed diving out of the clouds, like falcons. They were faster. They could climb better, and they could turn so tightly they seemed to dance in the air. Below Thach, 3 Wildcats of Fighting Squadron, 3 VF-3, held formation, flying in a loose V. They had no radar, no warning, no backup, just instinct and steel nerves. 43 American Wildcats had already been torn apart in one-on-one dogfights with the Zero in the last 3 weeks. Thach had seen the black smears in the water. He'd written the letters home. His wingman, Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, crackled through the radio. 6 coming in hot, Skipper. High 2 o'clock. Looks like they want a brawl. Thach didn't hesitate. Butch, remember the weave. There was a pause, just long enough for O'Hare to understand. Roger that. Matchstick maneuver. The term was an inside joke, born not in a combat manual, but in a tent months earlier on Oahu. 2 matchsticks, placed on a desk. Thach would move them like toy planes, sliding them together, crossing paths. What if instead of turning away from danger, you turned toward it? As the Zeros fell upon them, Thach shoved the throttle forward. The Wildcat roared. The plan was simple. Suicidal, maybe, but simple. His Wildcat veered left. O'Hare banked right. They were flying directly at one another, crossing at blistering speed like 2 birds playing chicken, while death followed close behind. To a Zero pilot's eyes, it looked like panic, a mistake. The perfect chance to close the gap and take the shot. It was anything but. As the 2 American planes crisscrossed, Thach yanked hard left, bringing his guns to bear on the Zero chasing O'Hare. The Japanese pilot hadn't expected that a second Wildcat suddenly in perfect position behind him. 4 .50 caliber Brownings lit up the sky. Metal shredded. The Zero spiraled into the sea. Another pair of Wildcats mirrored the maneuver to the west. Same outcome. A Zero caught unaware. The hunter becoming prey. The Japanese formation scattered. From the deck of the USS Saratoga, spotters watched the dogfight unfold with binoculars trembling in their hands. For weeks, they'd watched Zero after Zero dominate. But today was different. John Thach had just broken every rule the Navy taught him, and it worked. He didn't outfly the enemy. He outthought them. The sky over Wake Island crackled with fire and fury. But above it all, the Thach Weave had been born not in a briefing room, not in a textbook, but in the white-hot crucible of combat. October 1941. Pearl Harbor hadn't yet burned, but something darker already brewed in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat in a dimly lit operations tent on Oahu, hands moving across a crude plywood map table. The fan above ticked like a metronome in the humid air. Outside, engines droned, men barked orders, but inside, Thach wasn't hearing any of it. In front of him were 2 matchsticks. One was blue, one was red. His fingers moved them again. Slide, cross, turn, reverse. For 3 nights, he'd skip chow to sit with these slivers of wood. He didn't care if others thought it strange. What he was trying to do had never been done because no one had ever needed it this badly. He'd been receiving after-action reports out of China and the Philippines. Japanese Zeros, lightweight, almost fragile-looking, were ripping through Allied air power like paper. Reports spoke of a turn radius tighter than any Western fighter. Faster in the climb, quicker in the dive. It made no sense. On paper, the Zero was underarmed and thin-skinned. In practice, it ruled the skies. Thach knew the Wildcat couldn't win a turning fight. Not ever. It was tough, built like a flying anvil, but it was slower, clumsier, and guzzled fuel. Facing a Zero head-on meant going home in a body bag. So what do you do when the rules make defeat inevitable? You change the rules. He dragged the red match, the Zero, behind the blue one. The trap always looked the same. Pursuit. Advantage. But then, mid-pursuit, the blue turned toward another incoming blue. A collision course. A lunatic's idea. Just before they crossed, both pivoted sharply and reversed. Now the tail of the pursuer was exposed to the partner. One Wildcat lured, the other ambushed. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't pretty. But it didn't need to be. It needed to break the Zero's one unchallenged rule. No one survives the turn. In a moment of grim satisfaction, Thach leaned back. 2 against 2, weaving together like threads of rope, they could cover each other's backs. Mutual defense in motion. The idea was simple, but it spat in the face of everything the Navy had drilled into him since Annapolis. Dogfighting doctrine had always been based on splitting up, creating space, letting each pilot operate independently. Solo gunslingers. But that approach was getting American aviators killed. The Thach Weave, as it would later be called, was about loyalty in the sky. Interdependence, sacrificing style for survival. Letting the enemy chase one of you so the other could deliver the kill. Still, an idea on a table meant nothing. The test would come when bullets cracked through cloud and the sky tore open. Until then, it was just matchsticks and a hunch. Weeks later, Pearl Harbor was attacked. America was at war. And Thach's theory, born on a map table in the sticky Hawaiian dark, would soon be tested in fire. He didn't know it yet, but the matchstick maneuver wouldn't just save lives. It would change how pilots fought for the next 80 years. The 7th of May, 1942, south of the Solomon Islands. The sky was cloud-smeared, the sea below mottled with whitecaps, and it was about to become a proving ground. USS Lexington's radar room reported incoming bogies, dozens, Japanese carrier aircraft Aichi dive bombers, Nakajima torpedo bombers, and worse, Zeros. In the ready room of Fighting Squadron 3, John Thach slid his harness over his flight suit and glanced at the chalkboard. His name was scrawled on the lead line. Beside him, Ensign Butch O'Hare cracked his knuckles, chewing on the silence. They drilled the Weave once, not in combat, just a dry run at altitude. It had worked, sort of. But this was different. This was real. 21 Japanese planes were barreling in. They'd be there in minutes. Thach knew the odds. The Zero was still king in the Pacific. A one-on-one fight was suicide. Even with his armor and firepower, the Wildcat was a rhino up against panthers. "Stick close," he told his wingman. "No matter what, we weave or we die." He didn't explain further. At 12,000 feet, the first black specks appeared on the horizon. The sun behind them, eyes squinting through goggles. No time for elegance, no time for nerves. Just throttle forward and meet the storm. As the Zeros dove in, Thach and O'Hare split opposite directions just like they practiced. The Japanese pilots, trained in relentless pursuit, locked onto their tails. Then came the pivot. Both Wildcats turned sharply into each other, slicing the air like scissors. The Zero behind O'Hare tightened its turn to follow, but it had no idea it had entered a trap. Thach pulled through his arc, and as he crossed beneath O'Hare's path, he saw the enemy aircraft in perfect profile, close, exposed, vulnerable. He fired. 6. 50 caliber Brownings erupted. The Zero lit up like kindling, its left wing shearing off in flames. The pilot never had a chance. Behind them, another pair of Wildcats mirrored the maneuver. One was hit, trailing smoke. But even wounded, it bought time for its partner to come around the Weave, pulling tight, like cords of rope snapping under tension. By the end of the skirmish, they had shot down at least 4 Zeros with no losses. The Navy didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. There were no cheers back on the deck. Just the stink of cordite, oil-slicked boots on steel, and the quiet thud of flight suits hitting benches in the ready room. Thach pulled off his gloves. His hands were shaking, but his mind was steady. He sat with O'Hare, sipping tepid coffee. Neither said much. Then one of the younger pilots walked in. Lieutenant Junior Grade David Gertz. He'd seen the Weave in action from above. "Sir," he said, breathless, "what do you call that thing you just did?" Thach looked at him and, after a pause, simply said, "A way to stay alive." It didn't have a name. Not yet. But within weeks, Other squadrons began asking questions. Pilots who'd flown against Zeros and lived were rare. And Thach's boys weren't just surviving, they were winning. The word spread, not through memos, not through manuals, but through whispers, through hand gestures at chalkboards, through matchsticks and pencils on makeshift tables in war zone tents. In a war where minutes mattered and manuals came too late, it was pilots teaching pilots. The weave was out. Summer 1942. Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. The sun dipped behind the jungle ridge as heat rose in waves off the pierced steel runway. In a tent strung with blackout curtains and a single flickering lantern, a young pilot from VF-5 crouched over a crate, dragging a piece of charcoal across a sheet of plywood. His brow was damp with sweat, his eyes fixed on the zigzag lines he was drawing. Another pilot leaned in, watching. "You saw Thach do this?" The first nodded. 2 weeks ago, Coral Sea, he made a Zero disappear. They weren't just drawing, they were diagramming survival. All across the Pacific, fighter squadrons were passing it on, not through formal orders, but in barracks, bunks, carrier hangar bays, muddy airfields. The weave was going viral the old-fashioned way. Lieutenant Commander Thach wasn't writing combat manuals. He was writing letters, dozens of them, sent back to San Diego, to training squadrons, to Annapolis, to every commander he knew. "It's counterintuitive," he wrote in one. "But if 2 Wildcats coordinate fly together, not apart, they can defeat a Zero every time. I've seen it." He enclosed diagrams, circles and arrows, descriptions like, "One aircraft becomes the bait, the other becomes the hook." He didn't ask for permission. He just told them, "Try it before you bury more pilots." Back in the States, a few instructors at NAS Jacksonville began slipping it into classroom lectures, quietly, almost nervously. The Navy's official doctrine still emphasized the tally-ho and break method: scatter, separate, regain initiative. But in the Pacific, scatter meant die. In July, a squadron from USS Hornet rotated through Espiritu Santo for refit. A fresh-faced flight leader, Lieutenant Joseph Wiseman, walked into the briefing tent to find Thach's diagrams pinned beside a topographical map of Guadalcanal. He stared. "Who drew this?" A Marine mechanic looked up from cleaning a Browning. "One of Thach's boys. Told us to study it. Said it'll keep us alive." Word was out. But still, not everyone believed it. Some commanders scoffed, called it a gimmick. Others said it would only work with perfect timing, that green pilots couldn't pull it off. Thach ignored them. Instead, he kept refining, teaching. In one debrief with new pilots, he moved 2 coffee mugs across a table while describing the weave. "You'll feel like you're playing chicken. Trust the other man. You're not alone up there. That's the whole point." Even the veteran pilots started to change. Before, it had been every man for himself in the sky. Turn faster. Climb higher. Get behind the enemy. Now, they thought in pairs. In rhythm, wingmen became lifelines. And for the first time in months, the casualty charts started to tilt. Not just fewer losses, more kills. Confirmed. Tracked. 4 Wildcats down 6 Zeros in a single day near Tulagi. Another pair escaped an ambush entirely by weaving out, while 2 more Wildcats circled back in. Pilots returned from missions with torn rudders and oil-streaked canopies, but they returned. Back in Washington, naval aviation leadership was slow to respond. Official training material still made no mention of the weave. But the old ways were dying under the sun-baked skies of the South Pacific. Not because someone signed a paper, but because men were living who otherwise would have been buried at sea. By late August, instructors at Midway and Pearl Harbor were drawing intersecting arcs on chalkboards, no longer called crazy. Now, they called it standard practice. It wasn't just a maneuver anymore. It was a doctrine, one born not from books but from blood, from instinct, and from 2 matchsticks on a plywood desk. The 4th of June, 1942, 6:15 a.m., 15,000 feet above the Pacific. The roar inside Lieutenant James "Jig" Ramage's Wildcat was deafening. He banked hard left, his eyes catching the glint of the sun off dozens of Zeros streaking in above the clouds. The Battle of Midway had begun, and Task Force 17 had launched its fighter cover minutes earlier from USS Yorktown. Ramage wasn't alone. Beside him flew his wingman, Ensign Clayton Fisher, both assigned to VF-3, the very squadron John Thach had led just months before. Ramage had trained under Thach, heard the man explain the weave, using 2 pencils on a ready-room desk. He hadn't believed it then. But as 24 Zeros bore down on their dozen Wildcats, the time for skepticism was over. "Clay, execute the weave. You know the drill." Fisher responded instantly, angling his Wildcat away, drawing 2 Zeros behind him. Ramage rolled opposite, baiting another pair. For a moment it looked chaotic. Wildcats veering directly at one another in open sky while enemies chased close behind. But then, just as they'd practiced, they pivoted mid-approach. Ramage's guns caught the lead, Zero chasing Fisher, his tracers slicing through the air like hot needles. The Japanese fighter exploded in a flash of white flame and smoke. Another Wildcat in the distance executed the same pattern, one feinting escape, the other swinging back in for the kill. The dogfight turned the sky into a corkscrew of smoke trails and twisting wings. Down below, Japanese bombers surged toward the American carriers, but many didn't make it. Wildcats, despite their slower speeds and limited climb, were chewing into the bomber waves. Zeros tried to intervene, but every time they latched onto a tail, they found themselves in a snare. Even Admiral Fletcher's air combat log from Yorktown noted the change. Multiple enemy aircraft, downed by defensive maneuvering. Our fighters operated in coordinated pairs. Success rate appears tied to new technique. They didn't call it the Thach Weave, yet just the weave, but it was spreading like gospel. Thach himself wasn't in the air that day. He was ashore, analyzing footage, diagrams, and listening to pilot testimony. But his fingerprints were all over the battle. Of the 25 Zeros engaged by Wildcats during the initial phase, over a dozen were destroyed or driven off. Losses on the American side were lower than expected. In the heat of that battle, a dozen men lived because another man had once sat at a table with 2 matchsticks and a gut feeling the Navy was wrong. But it wasn't just about numbers. Pilots who once flew like lone wolves were now protecting each other mid-fight. They came back shaken, oil-streaked, faces black with smoke and sweat. But they came back in pairs. In the after-action reports, one pilot wrote, "It was like dancing with death, but someone was always watching your back. Amen." And that was the essence of the weave, not a tactic but a promise. You won't fight alone. As the sun set on June 4, the tide of the Pacific War had shifted. 4 Japanese carriers lay beneath the sea. The myth of Japanese air superiority cracked. And in the wake of that battle, training squadrons back in Florida, California, and Hawaii began modifying their curricula, quietly at first, but then with urgency. Flight instructors scribbled intersecting arcs on chalkboards. The words "mutual support" were underlined in bold. The Thach Weave had gone from a field trick to a foundational tactic, not because headquarters demanded it, but because it worked. It worked when it mattered most. July 1942. NAS, Jacksonville, Florida. The room smelled of chalk dust and coffee gone cold. Ceiling fans creaked above the heads of a dozen young aviation cadets hunched over notebooks. On the wall, a blackboard streaked with faint diagrams, arcs, arrows, and tightly looped paths. An instructor in his mid-30s tapped a long wooden pointer against the board. "Gentlemen, what you see here is not from any naval operations manual." A few of the cadets shifted in their seats, some curious, others skeptical. "This," the instructor continued, "was taught to me by a man who's still flying missions in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander John Thach. He figured out how to make a Wildcat do the one thing it was never built to do: survive a turning fight with a zero." A hand went up. The cadet looked barely 20. "Sir, respectfully, I thought we were trained to avoid turning altogether. Extend, climb, dive, break contact." The instructor smiled grimly. "That was before our boys started getting chewed up over the Coral Sea, before Midway, before the Japanese forced us to start thinking differently." He walked to the front and placed 2 pencils on a desk just like Thach had. "The weave isn't magic. It won't make you faster, but it will make you harder to kill. And that, gentlemen, is worth more than any manual." Word of the maneuver had reached the East Coast. Slowly, hesitantly. It wasn't in the official syllabus. Not yet. Doctrine still echoed out of the pre-war era sleek dogfights, imagined over flat farmland and under perfect weather. But the Pacific wasn't following the rules, and the instructors were listening. In late July, the Bureau of Aeronautics finally sent out an informal advisory. Just a 2-page bulletin. No headline, no signature from an admiral. Just a new term added to the glossary. Interweaving tactical defense. Pilots called it something else now, the Thach Weave. But back in the Pacific, Thach wasn't interested in titles. He was still flying, still teaching, and still watching new pilots die. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, August 1942, Thach walked the muddy line of parked Wildcats after another dusk patrol. He carried a notebook in one hand, a grease pencil in the other. The air reeked of cordite and exhaust. Somewhere in the distance, an engine coughed into silence. 2 new pilots approached him. Both looked young. Both had survived their first sortie. "Sir," one of them asked, "that weave you taught us, how tight do we turn when we cross?" Thach didn't answer right away. He knelt in the dirt and began drawing with the pencil, right there in the mud. A simple curve. Then a second, overlapping from the other side. Tight enough to put your guns on him, but not so tight you lose your wingman. He looked up. "If you make the enemy choose between 2 targets, he hesitates. That's your window." It was a language now, one spoken by men who'd learned that survival wasn't about being better, it was about being smarter together. The Navy's brass was slower to embrace it. Some argued it wasn't scalable. Others said it only worked against Zeros, not German aircraft. There were debates in Washington paper wars fought by men in clean uniforms, far from the noise and fire. But the pilots kept using it anyway. And every time a Wildcat landed with bullet holes stitched across its fuselage, and the pilot stepped out still breathing, that was another argument won. The Weave wasn't just surviving, it was spreading. In training centers, in airstrips from Espiritu Santo to the Solomons, in mess halls, briefing tents, and on the stained pages of every pilot's logbook. It was no longer a trick. It was a mindset. The 19th of June, 1944. The Philippine Sea. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft rose in waves to defend the Central Pacific flank carrier-based Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all thrown at the advancing American fleet in a desperate bid to hold back the tide. But the tide had already turned. By this point in the war, the U.S. Navy wasn't just flying Wildcats. Newer, faster, deadlier Hellcats filled the decks of Task Force 58. But what never changed, what stayed embedded in the bones of every fighter pilot launching into that clear June sky, was the training, the instinct, the weave. From the deck of USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Charles Brewer throttled forward in his F-6F Hellcat, his wingman tight off his port side. They'd been briefed on the incoming wave, estimated 200 enemy aircraft. Radar picked them up nearly 100 miles out. The intercept would happen high and fast. As the first Zeros broke through the top layer of American cap, Brewer snapped into motion. "Execute weave on my mark. Make it tight." The air battle that followed was less a clash of equals and more a systematic dismantling. While the Zero was still nimble, its pilots were green, many barely trained, some barely able to land on carriers. Meanwhile, the Americans flew in disciplined pairs. Every maneuver, every turn, every roll coordinated. In one corner of the sky, Ensign Duval Winters lured a Zero downward in a shallow dive. Just as the enemy closed for the kill, Winters banked left and crossed his wingman's path. From above and behind, Lieutenant John Kessler rolled in the trap sprung. A short burst, and the Zero disintegrated in midair. Again and again, the pattern repeated. The weave wasn't just defense anymore. It had become a fence bait and strike, rhythm and timing. A choreography written in fire. Radio calls filled the air. 2 bogies on my 6 engaging weave now. Copy, I'm swinging in behind you. Splash 1. Keep weaving. By midday, Over 300 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. American losses? Fewer than 30. Thach wasn't in the cockpit anymore. By 1944, he'd been promoted to commander and was serving on Admiral Spruance's staff. But his influence filled the skies that day. From the flag bridge, he listened to combat reports pouring in. Words like coordinated defense, mutual cover, and cross-pattern engagement. He knew what they meant. He'd once tried to describe it with 2 sticks on a desk. Now, it was etched into the very DNA of naval aviation. Back at the forward airbase on Saipan, pilots clambered down from their cockpits, soaked with sweat, faces streaked with soot. Some were grinning, others hollow-eyed, but many alive, because of a maneuver they barely had time to think through. It had become instinct, and it wasn't just American pilots using it anymore. Captured Japanese reports after the battle indicated that some Zero pilots, desperate to survive, had attempted similar pair maneuvers, clumsy imitations of the weave, but without the discipline, without the hours of practiced trust. It unraveled. That was the truth Thach had always known. The weave wasn't just a tactic, it was a relationship. 2 pilots trusting each other completely, in a place where a split second could mean death. It demanded courage not to fight the enemy, but to fly head-on toward a friend and believe he wouldn't flinch. In the skies above the Marianas, that trust had rewritten the outcome of the largest carrier battle in history. And the men who flew it? They didn't call it heroism. They just called it doing the job. Le 13 octobre 1944, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The sky was a dirty mix of smoke and broken clouds as Lieutenant Henry Hank Crosby leveled off at 10,000 feet. Below him, USS landing ships clustered off the eastern coast, unloading men and tanks onto Leyte's beaches. Above, dozens of Japanese aircraft were pouring in from the west, kamikazes, torpedo bombers, and an escort of veteran Zeros who hadn't given up the fight. Crosby flew a Hellcat now, just like most of the fleet, but his heart still beat to the rhythm of the old Wildcat days. His squadron had been drilled in the weave since flight school. It wasn't flashy anymore, just natural. His wingman, Ensign Reggie Holt, was Green First Combat Mission. Thach's name meant nothing to him, but to Crosby, it meant everything. "Reggie," he said over the radio, "whatever you do, stay close. We don't fight alone." The warning came a second later, AWACS call from a picket destroyer. Inbound bandits, 2 o'clock high, bearing 270-20 plus. The Japanese formation moved in fast, not just kamikazes, fighters too, experienced ones. The first clash came in a blink. Crosby spotted 2 Zeros diving toward a flight of TBM Avengers, lumbering torpedo bombers with nowhere to run. He broke left, exposing his 6 o'clock to the sky. Holt followed, tight. A Zero took the bait instantly. Crosby saw the glint of its nose cannon flashing as it chased him into the open. He didn't panic. Instead, he angled into the weave. Reggie mirrored him. At the crossover point, Crosby reversed sharply, and the Zero chasing him flew straight into Holt's guns. A clean burst fire and debris. It should have worked again on the second pass. But Holt was late. Just a second, 1 beat too slow. He overturned, left Crosby hanging in the open. The second Zero clipped Crosby's tail with a burst. Alarms lit up on his dash, oil pressure dropping fast. He pulled up hard, black smoke trailing. Holt was shouting over the radio, desperate, apologizing. "I missed it, sir. I missed the cross." Crosby grit his teeth. "It's not about perfect timing, Reggie. It's about trusting the other man enough to act before you're sure." He guided his damaged Hellcat back to the flat deck of the USS Princeton, skidding sideways, tailhook just catching the cable. Mechanics rushed in as he climbed out, legs shaking from the vibration, not the fear. Nearby, Holt landed clean, his face pale as chalk. Later that night, under red lights in the ready room, Crosby walked up to the young pilot and said something Holt would remember for the rest of his life. "The weave doesn't work because of the pattern. It works because we don't leave each other behind." The lesson burned deeper than the scar on Crosby's shoulder. War had changed. Kamikazes weren't chasing kills, they were seeking death. They couldn't be baited the same way. But still, the weave mattered. It wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was a code. Even as the enemy changed shape, even as the skies grew more crowded and the missiles faster, the foundation held. Two pilots, watching each other's six, trusting each other completely. That night, someone in the squadron scrawled a phrase on the inside wall of the briefing tent. "We don't fly alone. No initials, no signature." But every man knew where it came from. March 1945. Ulithi Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Thach stood alone on the deck of the USS Bunker Hill, hands clasped behind his back, watching a formation of Hellcats arc overhead. They moved in pairs, not tightly stacked, but spaced just right enough room to breathe, enough room to turn. Even now, with jet aircraft just months away from entering the war, the Weave still held. It had become second nature, as automatic as raising the landing gear or scanning the horizon. He didn't say anything as the planes disappeared into the afternoon haze. He didn't need to. The Weave wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them. Instructors across the Navy had refined it, adapted it. They'd broken it down into precise angles, distances, reaction times. What began with 2 matchsticks on a desk had become a standardized defensive maneuver taught at every major aviation training center from Pensacola to Pearl. But the soul of it, the rhythm, couldn't be diagrammed. It had to be felt. Thach remembered those early days in '42, when even fellow commanders rolled their eyes. When the idea of 2 pilots flying directly toward each other in combat was considered lunacy. Now it was gospel. Even the Army Air Forces had taken notice. P-47 Thunderbolt units escorting bombers over Germany had adopted a modified version of the Weave, not identical, but drawn from the same core. Mutual defense over individual glory. It didn't matter what aircraft you flew. The principle held. Protect your wingman, and he'll protect you. Thach's influence didn't stop with the tactic. His leadership style, calm, analytical, quietly demanding, became a model. He wasn't loud. He didn't pound tables or bark orders. He taught by example, by steadiness, by always returning with the men he led. Pilots who flew under him or with those trained by him carried a little of his method into every mission, every debrief, every decision. And in war, where doctrine often lagged behind reality, that kind of leadership saved lives. By the time the Okinawa campaign began, U.S. Navy air groups were weaving instinctively not just in the air, but in how they thought. Mutual cover, interlocked movement. Even the way formations refueled or returned to the carrier had evolved from that thinking. Years later, when Thach sat for interviews, reporters would ask him if he really knew what he had created. He always smiled and said the same thing. "All I wanted was to make sure we got home." In some circles, they called him a tactical genius. In others, just a damn good stick. But among the pilots, especially the ones who'd survived when they shouldn't have, his name meant something else. It meant trust. Pilots pinned his photo inside locker doors. Ground crews named stray dogs after him. A few even scrawled, "Weave this," on the sides of their cowlings like a badge of defiance. He never asked for that. But in a war that broke so many men, Thach had given something rare: control. Not over the enemy, but over fear, over chaos, over the feeling that death could come from any angle at any second. The Weave gave them a fighting chance. And when you're 12,000 feet above a burning ocean, that's everything. August 1945. The guns had not yet fallen silent, but something had shifted in the wind. In the ready rooms, in the engine bays, on the decks of carriers returning home, the tension had changed, not gone, just softened. Lieutenant Commander John Thach now wore the silver oak leaves of a full commander. He hadn't flown a combat sortie in months. His war was now fought with chalk, reports, and the ear of men who once dismissed his theories. One morning aboard the USS Yorktown, a pilot knocked softly on his office door. Young, fresh uniform, just back from Okinawa. "Sir," he said, "you don't know me. But I flew the Weave last week. We were outnumbered 4-1. It worked." He held out a photograph, grainy, mid-air capture. 2 Hellcats twisting in perfect opposition, crossing just as a 0 passed between them. A snapshot of the maneuver frozen in black and white. Thach took the photo in both hands, looked at it for a long time, then placed it face down on his desk. He didn't need to see it. He'd lived it too many times. As the war ground to its final days, something else began to happen quietly, unofficially. Instructors from other branches started asking about the Weave. The Air Force wanted to adapt it for jets. Marine pilots swore by it in close air support. Even the British, once skeptical, incorporated elements of the pattern into Fleet Air Arm dogfighting drills. And on the post-war lecture circuit, Thach found himself speaking to packed rooms. Not about glory or kills or medals, but about trust. He would walk to the podium, often without notes, and say the same thing to every room full of nervous, wide-eyed cadets. In a dogfight, the enemy's not your biggest threat. It's the moment you forget your wingman. Those who listened wrote it down. Those who didn't often found out the hard way. Thach retired in 1971 as a full admiral. But to the generations that followed, his legacy was sealed long before the stars on his shoulder. It was sealed in those first insane minutes over Wake Island, when two Wildcats had turned toward each other, not away, and changed the rules of aerial combat forever. In the decades that followed, the Thach Weave would evolve, restructured, modified, reinterpreted for supersonic jets and long-range missiles. But the soul of it remained unchanged. 2 aircraft, 2 lives, 1 maneuver, mutual survival. In the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, tucked beside a restored F-4F Wildcat, there's a plaque etched with his name. Tourists pass it every day, not knowing the whole story. But pilots know. They trace the diagram carved into the metal, the crossing arcs, the converging paths, and they remember the man who taught them, through action more than words, what it meant to never fly alone. John Thach passed away in 1981, but somewhere, high above the clouds, in the sharp turn of a fighter banking to protect its wingman, in the trust shared between two souls slicing through sky and silence, he's still flying,